Next generation wide field of view displays such as VR headsets offer a very high spatial and temporal resolution. This poses a significant challenge from a real-time rendering quality standpoint due to the stringent rendering time constraints. One of the most promising directions towards addressing this challenge is centered around understanding human perception in wide field of view settings. To gather information from a scene, humans tend to scan a scene through the eye movements, fixating on different points during the process. It has been well established that human spatial acuity decreases significantly moving away from the fixation point. Consequently, at a certain eccentricity, that is, the angular displacement from the fixation point to the stimulus in question, we lose our ability to discriminate between text. At higher eccentricities, we start losing our ability to discriminate between shapes, followed by color, and then motion. But why does this happen? Well, owing to centuries of evolution, our brains have converged into a very efficient information processing system, having learned to disregard redundant information from incoming stimuli and process only what is absolutely necessary. Consequently, a very simple interpretation of this is to think of the brain as a compression system for incoming stimuli. And like many compression systems, it is possible to have multiple different inputs mapped to the same encoding. This is what gives rise to something called spatial metamerism. Spatial metamerism is the existence of images that are structurally different from one another but perceptually equivalent. From an image synthesis standpoint, some of these metamers might be easier to synthesize compared to others. The observation is key behind understanding something called foveated rendering, when instead of rendering the entire scene in full resolution, we try to synthesize the cheapest possible metamer. The standard and most common technique for foveated rendering is to progressively reduce the shading rate away from the fixation point such that there is no noticeable quality degradation. But how does this shading rate reduction constitute a metamer? To get more insight, we need to understand how the visual system processes incoming stimuli. The key observation is that a significant body of cognitive psychology research advocates the brain role as a harmonic analyzer. Incoming stimuli can be decomposed into their constituent harmonics, and analyzing the response of the brain to these basis harmonics can give us a sight into the processing. To that end, let us do a harmonic decomposition of a full resolution image patch. It can be seen that the bands corresponding to higher spatial frequencies capture finer information. If we repeat the same process for a reduced shading rate patch, it can be seen that the high spatial frequency information is completely removed. The medium frequency level bands are attenuated, and only the low spatial frequencies are fully preserved. But how does this affect our perception in wide field of view settings? To understand this, we need to understand a few key concepts. Consider a user fixating at the center of a wide screen, being shown two gratings with different orientations. Due to our enhanced visual acuity at the fovea, our eyes can easily detect the stimuli and see that the orientations are different. We have the ability to both detect and resolve the stimulus. However, if the same gratings are shown at a higher eccentricity, due to a loss in spatial acuity, we may lose our ability to resolve the orientations of these two gratings, and they might appear to be visually indistinguishable. Therefore, we say that this stimulus is now only detectable but not resolvable. At even higher eccentricities, we may even lose our ability to even detect the presence of this stimulus. It has been established that this effect can be quantified as frequency detectability and resolvability limits of human vision as a function of eccentricity. At the fovea, we can resolve all spatial frequencies accurately. However, at higher eccentricities, we lose our ability to even detect very high spatial frequencies. Middle level frequencies are now only detectable but not resolvable, and we can only accurately resolve lower spatial frequencies. And this trend continues with increasing eccentricity. This observation is the key to explaining how shading rate reduction can constitute a spatial metamer. If the spatial frequencies attenuated due to shading rate reduction are neither detectable nor resolvable, the presence or absence of these frequencies constitute the same thing, and we get a metamer of the full resolution rendering. However, if the shading rate reduction is more aggressive, the detectable spatial frequencies are now attenuated and the loss of resolution starts becoming visible. The thing is, reducing the shading rate provides significant computational benefits, and we would like to push this reduction as much as possible under the constraint that there is no detectable loss in quality. So what's the solution? A very elegant approach is to boost the attenuated spatial frequencies using eccentricity-dependent contrast enhancement. And this works considerably well, provided that the detectable spatial frequencies are only attenuated. For more aggressive shading rate reductions, these spatial frequencies may be completely removed and we cannot get them back using contrast enhancement. In these circumstances, previous work has employed content synthesis techniques such as neural networks to hallucinate missing spatial frequency information. Visually, this approach is extremely effective but also very expensive. So ultimately, our goal was to find a fast frequency synthesis technique to hallucinate lost detectable spatial frequencies, and something called Gabor Noise proved to be an ideal candidate. Gabor Noise can be synthesized by convolving Gabor patches with a set of random impulses. The convolution essentially corresponds to many superimposed copies of the patches interacting with one another, resulting into the Gabor Noise pattern. Each Gabor patch can be characterized by 3 parameters. And what makes this noise very attractive for our target application is that we have strict spectral control, as well as the ability to control orientations and amplitudes for our synthesis. So without further ado, what our technique does is to take a foveated rendering image as input and hallucinate the lost spatial frequencies using Gabor noise. Contrast enhancement is performed on the foveated image to boost attenuated spatial frequencies, and a synthesized noise is added on top of the contrast enhanced image to deliver the final output. And now the key question: how does this content dependent noise synthesis work? Firstly, we take a foveated rendering image as input and sample impulses to act as seeds for our noise. Now, we have to estimate content and perception dependent parameters for our Gabor patches corresponding to each of these impulses. For the frequency, it is important to remember that we aim to synthesize spatial frequencies that are detectable but not resolvable, as we do not want the observers to be able to resolve that the content we add is unnatural. For this, we rely on psychovisual studies quantifying human spatial frequency resolvability as a function of eccentricity. It can be seen that the limits shift toward lower spatial frequencies as the eccentricity increases. For the orientation, we compute a Gaussian pyramid of the foveated image and use simple Sobel filtering to estimate per pixel orientations at a higher pyramid level. The motivation behind sampling orientation from a higher level is that they will vary smoothly between frames in a video and aid in temporal consistency. For estimating the amplitudes, we rely on an assumption grounded in natural image statistics that energies of different spatial frequencies are correlated with one another. So even though high spatial frequencies are completely missing, we can estimate their energy from the preserved lower spatial frequencies. To this end, we build a Laplacian pyramid of the foveated image and estimate the Gabor amplitude from the accurately preserved frequency bands. So, now that we have all the 3 parameters for our Gabor patches corresponding to each impulse, we simply convolve the required Gabors with our set of impulses to synthesize the required noise. This noise is thereafter added on top of the contrast enhanced image to return our final output, which acts as a spatial metamer to the full resolution rendering. We verify this claim experimentally and observe that for foveation levels at which users can easily see the quality degradation with respect to the full resolution image, our enhancement delivers a metamer that is visually indistinguishable from the high quality image, all in a matter of a few milliseconds. However, we observed that for video sequences, if the noise is uncorrelated between frames, it leads to temporal instability. We take a number of steps to address this issue. Firstly, the impulse locations are kept constant throughout a video sequence, so that the Gabor patches do not shift positions between frames. Regarding the parameters, we observed that the orientations of the corresponding Gabor patches can change between frames. Firstly, because we took care in sampling orientations from a higher pyramid level so that they vary smoothly. And secondly, because our synthesized spatial frequencies are controlled to be not resolvable. So the changes in orientation do not cause temporal artifacts. As the Gabor amplitudes are content dependent, they can also vary smoothly for the corresponding Gabor patches between frames. However, we observed that changing the frequencies of corresponding Gabor patches between frames can lead to artifacts, and they must be kept the same. Owing to these considerations, we can generate temporally stable metamers. So, in summary, our method takes as an input a single frame from foveated rendering. Then, it estimates content-dependent noise parameters such as amplitude and orientation. Next, it applies contrast enhancement to the input frame to boost attenuated spatial frequencies and adds our synthesized noise to hallucinate frequencies that were not generated during the foveation process. So now, with that done, what's next? Owing to the spatial frequency selective nature of the human visual system, we can also build our framework to manipulate cues such as depth and motion for real-time foveated graphics, as our perception of these aspects has also been studied in terms of constituent harmonics. So that's it, and thank you very much for listening.